Hi everyone, welcome to the channel After All That Years.
The moment I saw my wife holding another man's hand in that coffee shop, I knew our 10-year marriage was nothing but an elaborate fiction. My name is James, and I'm 58 years old. Until that Tuesday afternoon in March, I genuinely believed Sandra and I had built something real together. We never had children. Sandra said she wasn't ready, then later that her career was too demanding, and eventually we just stopped talking about it. But our life seemed complete anyway. Weekend getaways to the mountains where we'd hike for hours without saying much, but somehow understanding each other perfectly. Lazy Sunday mornings where we'd spread the newspaper across our kitchen table, trading sections and commenting on articles. Those deep conversations that stretched well into the night about our dreams, our fears, the books we were reading, the places we wanted to visit when we retired. At least, that's the story I'd been telling myself for the past decade. Looking back now, I can see the cracks that started appearing maybe 2 years ago. Sandra began working later, claiming new clients were demanding. She'd come home exhausted, barely able to manage more than a few sentences about her day before disappearing into a hot bath. Our weekend getaways became less frequent. The conversations grew shorter, more superficial. When I'd suggest we plan a vacation or try a new restaurant, she'd agree but seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Work had been lighter than usual that Tuesday, a rare gift in my accounting firm during tax season. I decided to surprise Sandra with those yellow tulips she'd always loved and maybe convince her to leave her interior design studio early for once. She'd been pulling back from me recently, claiming her workload was crushing her and she needed room to think clearly. I figured it was just the usual stress from difficult clients and tight deadlines. Interior design could be brutal, especially when you were dealing with wealthy homeowners who changed their minds every other day. I had this whole plan mapped out in my head. I'd show up with the flowers, we'd grab coffee at that little place she discovered last year, the one with the hand-painted tiles and the barista who remembered everyone's order. Maybe we'd walk through the park afterward, talk about plans for the summer. Simple things that married couples do to reconnect. When I spotted her through the cafe window, my first instinct was actually relief. There she was, more animated and joyful than I'd witnessed in months. Her whole face was lit up, the way it used to be when we first started dating, and she'd tell me about her latest design project, or a book that had completely captivated her. For a split second, I thought maybe whatever had been weighing her down was finally lifting. Then I noticed the man sitting across from her, someone I'd never seen before in all our years together. Mid-40s maybe, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of confident posture that comes from success. The way they leaned toward each other across that small round table, how naturally her fingers intertwined with his. The intimate bubble they seemed to exist in together while the rest of the cafe buzzed around them. My stomach dropped like a stone. I stood there on the sidewalk for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, watching through the window like some kind of stalker. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe he was a colleague she'd mentioned, but I'd forgotten. Maybe they were discussing a big project, and what looked like intimacy was just professional enthusiasm. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation for why my wife was holding hands with a stranger in our favorite coffee shop. But the longer I watched, the clearer it became that this wasn't business. The way she threw her head back when she laughed, how she leaned forward to whisper something that made him smile, the gentle way she traced her thumb across his knuckles. These weren't the gestures of professional collaboration, these were the movements of two people who were falling in love. Or maybe already had. I walked into that cafe with flowers in my hand and my heart hammering so hard against my ribs, I was sure everyone could hear it. The smell of coffee and fresh pastries that usually felt welcoming now seemed overwhelming, almost nauseating. Neither of them saw me approaching until I was practically standing over their table, casting a shadow across their intimate little world. When Sandra finally looked up, the transformation was instant and devastating. The blood drained from her face so fast, I thought she might actually faint. Her hand jerked away from his, like she'd been burned, and for a moment she just stared at me with the wide-eyed look of someone who'd been caught doing something unforgivable. The man, tall, well-dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that comes from getting away with things for years, turned to study me with what I can only describe as curious detachment. Not embarrassed, not apologetic. Just mildly interested, like I was an unexpected, but not particularly threatening development in his day. "James," Sandra whispered, her voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. "What are you doing here?" It was such a ridiculous question. What was I doing there? I was surprising my wife with flowers, the way I'd done dozens of times over the years. The way any husband might do on a random Tuesday afternoon. The better question was what she was doing there, holding hands with a stranger while her wedding ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I pulled out my phone with hands that were surprisingly steady, opened the Notes app and typed 4 words. "Don't come home tonight." My fingers moved almost automatically, like some part of my brain had already accepted what the rest of me was still trying to process. I placed the phone on the table between them, right next to their intertwined coffee cups, and watched her read it. Her face went completely white. I'd never seen Sandra look truly afraid before, not even during the worst fights of our marriage, not even when her father died suddenly 3 years ago. But in that moment, she looked terrified. The man glanced at my message, then back at me, completely unfazed. He had the audacity to look almost amused, like this was just another Tuesday afternoon entertainment for him. Like discovering someone's husband was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his day. "James, let me explain," Sandra started, her voice cracking slightly, but I was already turning away. I left the yellow tulips on their table, a splash of bright color against the dark wood, and headed for the door. Behind me, I could hear her voice calling my name, getting more desperate with each repetition, but I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. In my car, I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped. The leather was warm from the afternoon sun, and I found myself focusing on that small detail because everything else felt too enormous to process. The woman I'd trusted with everything, my heart, my future, my daily mundane happiness, was sitting in public with another man, holding his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, watching people walk by on the sidewalk, all of them going about their normal Tuesday afternoon business, while my entire world rearranged itself. A mother pushing a stroller, a businessman checking his phone, a teenage couple sharing earbuds and laughing at something on a screen, all of them living in a reality where marriages meant something, where trust wasn't just a naive concept, where the person you loved didn't casually destroy everything you'd built together over coffee and pastries. But somehow, even in that moment of complete devastation, I knew the worst was still coming. Sandra came home anyway that night. I'd been sitting on our couch since around 6, staring at a blank television screen, not really seeing anything, but not able to focus enough to actually turn it on. My mind kept replaying every detail from the cafe, like a movie I couldn't stop watching. The way she'd laughed, that genuine, delighted laugh I used to think, was reserved just for me. How comfortable they'd looked together, like they'd done this 100 times before. The practiced way she'd pulled her hand back when she saw me, as if she'd rehearsed what to do if she got caught. When I heard her key in the lock around 9:30, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Part of me had wondered if she'd actually respect my note and stay away. Another part of me had been hoping she'd come back so we could have this conversation, and maybe, somehow, she could explain everything in a way that made sense. She walked through our front door like she owned the place, which I suppose she still did. No trace of guilt or shame on her face, just the practiced composure of someone who'd spent hours preparing for this conversation. She was still wearing the same blue dress she'd had on at the cafe, the one I'd complimented that morning when she was getting ready for work. Had she chosen it for him? Had she stood in front of our bedroom mirror, trying on different outfits and wondering which one would make her look most attractive for her afternoon rendezvous? "James," she said, setting her purse down on the chair near the door with deliberate calm. Her voice was steady, controlled. "We need to discuss this." I didn't move from the couch, didn't even acknowledge that she'd spoken. I was studying the pattern in our area rug, thinking about how we'd picked it out together at that little furniture store downtown. She'd loved the deep blues and greys, said it reminded her of the ocean at dusk. Now it just looked like evidence of a life we'd built on lies. She sighed, actually sighed, like I was being unreasonable, and walked over to perch on the edge of the couch. Not close enough to touch me, but close enough that I could smell her perfume. The same perfume she'd worn on our first date, our wedding day, every anniversary since. Had she been wearing it for him too? The sheer audacity of her casual demeanor made my blood boil. She was treating this like we needed to discuss whose turn it was to do the dishes, not like she'd just destroyed our entire marriage. "It isn't what you think," she began, using that careful, measured tone people use when they're trying to calm down an unpredictable animal. "Really?" I finally turned to face her, and I could see her flinch slightly at whatever expression she found there. Because what I think is that my wife was on a date with another man this afternoon, holding his hand and laughing like she hasn't laughed with me in years. So if that's not what happened, please by all means enlighten me. Sandra straightened her shoulders, shifting into what I recognized as her professional mode, the voice she used with difficult clients. His name is Kevin. We work together sometimes on commercial projects. We were discussing a renovation proposal, that's all. I stood up and started pacing the length of our living room, past the family photos that suddenly seemed like evidence from someone else's life. You don't hold hands during business meetings, Sandra. You don't look at contractors like they hung the moon and stars. You don't whisper secrets and laugh like teenagers in love while discussing renovation proposals. For just a moment I saw it. The guilt, the fear flickering behind her carefully constructed facade. But she recovered quickly, shifting into defensive mode like she always did when cornered. You're overreacting, you're seeing things that aren't there. You're making this into something it's not. Nothing inappropriate happened. Stop lying to me. The words exploded out of me, echoing through our living room and probably into the neighbors' houses. I'd never shouted at Sandra before, not in 10 years of marriage, not even during our worst arguments. I saw everything, Sandra. Every gesture, every look, every moment of intimacy between you two. Don't stand there and insult my intelligence. She crossed her arms, her jaw setting in that stubborn way I knew so well. For a moment, she looked like she was going to continue the charade, keep insisting it was all innocent. But something in my expression must have convinced her that the game was up. Fine, she said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. You want complete honesty? Yes, I've been spending time with Kevin, but it's not what you're imagining. It's not physical. Nothing has happened in that sense. It's just emotional. Emotional, I repeated, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. What exactly is emotional about cheating on your husband? I haven't cheated, she snapped, color rising in her cheeks. Not in the way you mean. We talk, yes. We connect intellectually. But I've been unhappy, James. For a long time. Kevin listens to me. He understands parts of me that you don't seem to see anymore. Her words hit like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. So this is my fault? You're saying this happened because I somehow failed you? The silence that followed felt like it lasted for hours. Sandra looked down at her hands, and I could see her wedding ring glinting in the lamplight. When had she started taking it off for her meetings with Kevin? When had she started living a double life so seamlessly that she could come home to me every night and pretend everything was normal? I'm not saying it's your fault, she said finally, but her tone suggested otherwise. I'm saying that people grow apart sometimes. I'm saying that Kevin and I have a connection that I haven't felt in a long time. I shook my head, feeling my heart crack into 1,000 pieces. You could have talked to me, Sandra. You could have told me you were unhappy. We could have gone to counseling, taken a vacation, tried to reconnect. Instead, you went behind my back and found someone else to understand you. She stood up, arms still crossed defensively. I didn't plan for this to happen, James. It just did. These things happen. And honestly, I'm not even sure I want to try fixing this anymore. Maybe this is just where we are now. Those words were a knife straight through my heart. Not because they were cruel, but because of how casually she said them. Like our 10-year marriage was just a business arrangement that had stopped being profitable. Then why are you here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you come back instead of staying with him? She hesitated, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she decided how much truth to tell me. Because I wasn't ready to leave yet. I wanted to talk to you first, see if we could work out some kind of arrangement. Maybe we could stay married but have more. Freedom. The words made my blood turn cold. An arrangement. She wanted to keep our marriage as a convenient facade while she pursued her relationship with Kevin. She wanted me to be complicit in my own humiliation. Get out, I said through gritted teeth. James, please. No, you made your choice, Sandra. You chose him over me, over our marriage, over everything we built together. Now I'm making mine. Pack your things and leave. I can't do this anymore. For a moment I thought she might argue. She opened her mouth like she was going to try to convince me to accept her proposed arrangement. But something in my expression must have told her it was pointless. She just nodded, turned around and walked upstairs to pack. As I listened to drawers opening and closing above me, footsteps moving back and forth across our bedroom floor, I sat back down on the couch and tried to process what had just happened. My marriage was over. The woman I'd loved for over a decade had been living a lie, carrying on an emotional affair while coming home to me every night and pretending everything was fine. She'd been planning to keep me as some kind of backup plan while she explored her feelings for someone else. But even in that moment of complete devastation, I had no idea how much worse it was about to get. Sandra didn't take long to pack. She came downstairs about an hour later with a single suitcase and one of those large tote bags she used for work. Her face was composed again, like she'd used the packing time to rebuild her emotional walls. For a moment, she stood in our entryway, looking like she wanted to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe another attempt at justification. "Where will you go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. I'm not sure why I even cared at that point. Maybe it was just habit after 10 years of marriage, the automatic concern for someone who'd been the center of my daily life for so long. "To a friend's place," she replied without meeting my eyes. She was looking at the family photos on our hallway table, pictures of us from happier times. Our wedding day, vacation shots from Costa Rica, the Christmas morning when we'd opened gifts in our pajamas and laughed until our stomachs hurt. "Kevin?" I asked bluntly, because I was tired of dancing around the truth. She froze, her grip tightening on her suitcase handle. That pause, that moment of stillness, told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't going to a friend's house. She was going directly to him, to continue the relationship that had been more important to her than our marriage. "You know what? Don't answer that," I said, waving my hand dismissively. "Just go." Without another word, she walked out our front door, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where she'd stood, replaying every moment of the past few months with new understanding. The late nights at the office suddenly made sense. The sudden weekend work trips to nearby cities. The constant stream of excuses for why she couldn't make dinner plans or couldn't join me for our usual Saturday morning walks. The way she'd started keeping her phone face down on the table, the way she'd begun taking calls in the other room. All the small changes that I'd attributed to work stress, or the natural evolution of a long marriage. I'd been living with a stranger for months, maybe longer. The woman who'd kissed me goodbye that morning, who'd smiled when I complimented her dress, who'd reminded me to pick up milk on my way home, that woman had been planning to meet another man for an intimate afternoon, while I sat in my office working on tax returns and thinking about how to surprise her with flowers. But just when I thought I'd reached the bottom of this betrayal, when I thought I understood the full scope of what she'd done, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You did the right thing, James. She's not worth it. Thought you should know what she's really been up to. Check your email." My heart started pounding again. Who was this? And how did they know what had just happened? How did they even have my number? I looked at our front windows, wondering if someone had been watching the house. But the street was empty, except for Mrs. Henderson walking her dog like she did every evening. Curiosity overcame caution. I opened my laptop, the same one Sandra and I had used to plan vacations, research restaurants, watch movies together on quiet Sunday afternoons, and found an email waiting with the subject line, "The Truth About Sandra." I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the mouse. Did I really want to know more? Hadn't I already learned enough to destroy whatever was left of my trust in her? But of course, I couldn't leave it alone. When your world has already exploded, you need to see the full extent of the damage. I clicked it open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Dozens of photographs, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens camera. Sandra and Kevin walking hand in hand down city streets I recognized. Entering hotels together, coming out hours later looking disheveled and happy. Kissing in the parking lot of a restaurant we'd never been to together. The timestamps went back months, some from as far back as last October. While I'd been planning our anniversary dinner, researching restaurants and making reservations, she'd been meeting Kevin in hotel rooms. While I'd been picking out a gift pendant with her birthstone that she'd admired in a jewelry store window, she'd been building an entirely separate life with someone else. And then there was the video. Shaky and low quality, obviously taken through a window, but unmistakably Sandra's voice. James will never figure it out. He's too trusting, too comfortable. He thinks everything is fine as long as I come home every night and play the dutiful wife. The laughter that followed her laughter, bright and cruel, cut through me like a blade. I slammed the laptop shut so hard I was surprised the screen didn't crack. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my lungs. This wasn't just an emotional affair that had gotten out of hand. This wasn't a recent development that she'd been struggling with. This was a calculated long-term deception. She'd been lying to me for months, maybe longer, coming home to me every night and pretending to be my loving wife while secretly mocking my trust in her. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the humiliation. Someone had been watching, documenting, collecting evidence of my wife's affair. Someone had seen her making a fool of me and decided I needed to know about it. But who? And why? I barely slept that night, staring at the ceiling of our bedroom, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and whisper of wind felt too loud in the silence Sandra had left behind. I kept thinking about that video, her voice saying I'd never figure it out. How long had she been laughing at me? How many times had she and Kevin discussed my naivety, my willingness to believe her excuses? By morning, my exhaustion had crystallized into something harder. Determination. I wasn't going to let this go. Sandra thought she could play me for a fool, thought she could move on to her new life without consequences. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. My first step was responding to the unknown number that had texted me. I kept my message direct. Who are you? Why are you telling me this? The reply came within minutes, like whoever it was had been waiting by their phone. A friend. Let's just say I know Sandra better than you realize. She's not who you think she is. If you want the whole story, meet me at Riverside Park near your house at 2 p.m. I'll be wearing a grey jacket. I stared at the message, part of me thinking this was insane. Meeting a stranger who claimed to have insider knowledge about my wife's affair felt like something out of a bad television drama. But another part of me was consumed by the need to know. If there was more to Sandra's betrayal, if this went deeper than what I'd already discovered, I had to find out. By 1:45, I was parked near the park entrance, my heart racing despite my attempts to stay calm. The park was mostly empty except for a few joggers and a mother pushing her toddler on the swings. Normal people living normal lives while I prepared to meet a mysterious informant who apparently had a surveillance operation focused on my wife. At exactly 2 p.m., I saw someone in a grey jacket walking toward a bench under an old maple tree. Taking a deep breath, I got out of the car and approached. As I got closer, I could see it was a man, probably in his mid-30s, with a face that looked vaguely familiar, but that I couldn't quite place. "James?" he asked as I approached, his voice quiet and steady. "Yeah, and you are?" "Call me Ben," he said, gesturing for me to sit on the bench beside him. I hesitated. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea. But eventually I sat down, keeping some distance between us. "How do you know Sandra?" Ben let out a bitter laugh that made me think he had his own painful history with deception. "I used to work with her. We were involved for a while, about 2 years ago. But I learned the hard way what kind of person she really is." The pieces started falling into place. Sandra had briefly worked with a firm that handled both residential and commercial projects. She'd mentioned a colleague named Ben a few times, always in passing, always in contexts that seemed purely professional. I'd never thought to question it. "What's that supposed to mean?" Ben pulled out his phone and handed it to me. "See for yourself." On the screen were text messages, dozens of them, conversations between Sandra and someone saved as K in her contacts. The messages were explicit, not just in their sexual content, but in their casual cruelty toward me. Plans for afternoon meetings at hotels, jokes about how easy I was to deceive, detailed discussions about their future together and how they'd manage the transition away from their respective spouses. "She's been seeing Kevin for almost a year," Ben said as I scrolled through the messages with growing horror. "He's married too, by the way. Wife and 2 kids in the suburbs, the whole perfect family facade. I found out about their affair when I caught them together at a company Christmas party. Sandra didn't even care that I saw them, just told me to mind my own business and walked away." I stared at the messages, feeling physically sick. One conversation from just 3 weeks ago showed Sandra complaining about having to play the loving wife, when what she really wanted was to be with Kevin full-time. Another showed her making fun of a gift I'd given her, a book of poetry she'd claimed to love, calling it exactly the kind of sentimental garbage James thinks is romantic. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, handing his phone back with hands that weren't quite steady. Why now? Because I've been where you are, he said, his voice softening slightly. I know what it's like to feel like a complete fool. I know what it's like to realize that someone you trusted was making jokes about you behind your back. I thought you deserved to know the truth before she destroys you completely. What do you mean, destroys me completely? Ben was quiet for a moment, studying my face. She's not planning to just quietly divorce you, James. She and Kevin have been talking about taking you for everything they can get. Your house, your savings, your retirement accounts. They think because you're trusting, because you've been a good husband, that you'll just roll over and let them have whatever they want. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Sandra been betraying me emotionally and physically, but she'd been planning to destroy me financially too. She wanted to take everything I'd worked for and use it to build a new life with Kevin. How do you know all this? Because I've been watching them, Ben admitted. I know how that sounds, but after what Sandra did to me, I couldn't just let it go. I started paying attention, documenting things. I thought someday I might need evidence to protect myself or someone else. As disturbing as it was to learn that Ben had been essentially stalking Sandra and Kevin, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. Without his surveillance, I might never have learned the full scope of what they were planning. She's not going to stop, James, Ben added as we prepared to part ways. People like Sandra don't change. They just get better at hiding what they're doing. But now that you know the truth, you can protect yourself. I left the park feeling more broken than ever, but also feeling something I hadn't expected. Clarity. Sandra and Kevin thought they could manipulate me, thought they could take advantage of my trust and decency to get whatever they wanted. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. Driving home from the park, I could barely keep my hands steady on the steering wheel. Ben's words kept echoing in my head. She's not going to stop. But it wasn't just fear that was driving me now. It was anger, pure, focused anger at being manipulated and underestimated. I'd spent our entire marriage being the accommodating husband, the one who compromised, who avoided conflict, who trusted Sandra's word even when small inconsistencies nagged at me. She'd clearly interpreted my decency as weakness, my trust as stupidity. Well, she was about to discover that being nice didn't mean being naive. When I got home, I immediately started researching Kevin. Ben had mentioned his last name during our conversation, and it didn't take long to find him on social media. His profiles painted the picture of a perfect family man. Kevin Morrison, successful architect, devoted husband to Jennifer, proud father of 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Michael. The photos made me feel sick. Kevin at his daughter's soccer game, cheering from the sidelines. Family vacation pictures from Disney World, Kevin carrying his son on his shoulders while Jennifer walked beside them, all of them grinning at the camera. A recent post celebrating his wife's promotion at work, calling her the most amazing woman I know, and thanking her for being his partner in everything. Meanwhile, he'd been spending afternoons in hotel rooms with my wife, planning to leave Jennifer and take half of everything she'd worked for. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it also gave me an idea. I saved screenshots of his posts, his work profile, anything that showed the life he was pretending to live while carrying on his affair. If Sandra and Kevin thought they could destroy my life without consequences, they were about to learn otherwise. As I was researching, my phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. I need to pick up the rest of my things tomorrow. Will you be home? The casual tone, the assumption that she could just waltz back into our house like nothing had happened, was infuriating. But it also presented an opportunity. I'll be here. Come at 5, I replied. I spent the entire next day preparing for her visit. I printed every photo Ben had shown me, every text message, every piece of evidence that revealed the true scope of her deception. I also printed screenshots from Kevin's social media photos of him, with his wife and children, posts about family values and commitment. I wanted Sandra to see exactly what kind of man she was destroying her marriage for. I arranged everything neatly on our dining room table, the same table where we'd eaten dinner together thousands of times, where we'd paid bills and planned vacations and talked about our future. Now it would be the place where I showed her I knew everything. At exactly 5 p.m., Sandra walked in. She looked impeccable as always, her hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, wearing a crisp white blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than most people spent on clothes in 6 months. She'd always cared about appearances, about projecting success and control. Today, I was going to shatter that control completely. "I'm just here to get my stuff," she said curtly, not quite meeting my eyes as she headed for the stairs. "Not so fast," I said, stepping into her path. "We need to talk first." She rolled her eyes with theatrical exasperation. "James, we've already been through this. There's nothing left to say." "Oh, but there is," I said, my voice calm and steady. "You see, I've learned quite a bit since our last conversation. Sit down." Something in my tone must have gotten her attention because she actually looked at me. Really looked for the first time since she'd walked in. I pointed toward the dining room table. Her eyes flicked to the table, and I watched her face go completely pale when she saw the pile of papers spread out there. For a moment, she looked like she might bolt for the door, but curiosity, or maybe the need to know how much I'd discovered, won out. She walked slowly to the table and sat down, her hands trembling slightly as they rested in her lap. "What is this?" she asked, though we both knew she already had a pretty good idea. "This," I said, spreading the photos out in front of her like a dealer laying out cards, "is everything. The hotel visits that started last October. The text messages where you mock my trust and plan your future with Kevin. The conversations about how to take me for everything I'm worth in a divorce." Sandra stared at the evidence, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I'd never seen her at a loss for words before. Even during our worst arguments, she'd always been quick with explanations and justifications. "And this," I continued, laying out the screenshots from Kevin's social media, "is your perfect family man. The devoted husband and father who posts about commitment and family values while planning to abandon his wife and children for you." Her composure was cracking visibly now. I could see the panic building in her eyes as she realized the full scope of what I knew. "James, I can explain." "No," I said firmly, slamming my hand down on the table hard enough to make her jump. "You've done enough explaining. You've lied to me for months, probably longer. You've made me look like a fool while you and Kevin laughed about how easy I was to deceive. Now it's my turn to talk." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "You betrayed me in every way possible. Emotionally, physically, financially. You planned to destroy my life so you could build a new one with someone else's husband. You came home to me every single night and pretended to be my loving wife while secretly planning my destruction." Sandra's face was white now, real fear creeping into her expression. "What do you mean? What are you going to do?" I leaned forward, looking directly into her eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you, Sandra. I'm not going to do anything illegal or unethical. But I'm also not going to let you walk away from this without facing any consequences. You thought I was too trusting, too nice, too weak to fight back. You were wrong." She didn't respond, just sat there staring at the evidence of her betrayal spread out before her. For once in our entire relationship, Sandra had absolutely nothing to say. "Pack your things and go," I said quietly. "And understand that this is just the beginning. You and Kevin wanted to play games with people's lives. Now you get to find out what happens when those people decide to play back." As she gathered her belongings and left our house for what I knew would be the last time, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. The woman I'd loved was gone, had been gone for months apparently. But at least now I was dealing with reality instead of living in her carefully constructed fiction. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The silence Sandra left behind felt different this time. Not just empty, but somehow charged with possibility. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was in control of my own life instead of just reacting to whatever Sandra decided to do. But I wasn't going to let her and Kevin simply disappear into their new life together without consequences. They'd made their choices, and now they were going to live with the results. My first move was simple and direct. I drafted an email to Kevin's wife, Jennifer. I'd found her contact information through Kevin's business website. She worked as a marketing coordinator at a non-profit downtown. The email was brief and to the point. "Dear Jennifer, I don't know you, but I believe you deserve to know the truth about your husband. I've attached evidence of his affair with my wife Sandra. If you'd like to discuss this further, please let me know. James Mitchell." I attached the photos, the text messages, and screenshots showing the timeline of their relationship. I hesitated for a long moment before hitting send, my finger hovering over the mouse. Was I crossing a line? Was this revenge or justice? Then I remembered Sandra's voice in that video. "James will never figure it out. He's too trusting." I remembered her laughing about the poetry book I'd given her, calling it sentimental garbage. I remembered all those nights she'd come home late, kissing me hello while carrying the scent of another man's cologne. I clicked send and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not satisfaction or vindictiveness, but genuine relief. Jennifer deserved to know what her husband was really doing with his time, just like I deserved to know what my wife was doing with hers. The response came faster than I'd anticipated. The next morning, I found an email waiting in my inbox. "James, thank you for reaching out. I suspected something was wrong, but I never imagined it was this extensive. Would you be willing to meet in person? I think we should talk." Jennifer Morrison. We arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown, far from both of our neighborhoods. When I arrived, Jennifer was already there, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup like she was trying to warm herself. She was elegant in an understated way, not flashy like Sandra had become, but genuinely beautiful with kind eyes that looked tired and sad. "James?" she asked as I approached, and when I nodded she gestured for me to sit across from her. "Jennifer, I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." She managed a weak smile. "So am I. But I'm grateful you contacted me. I've been living with this nagging feeling that something was wrong for months. But Kevin always had explanations for everything. Late nights, weekend work trips, sudden changes in his schedule. I started to think I was going crazy." "You're not crazy," I said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Unfortunately, you were right to be suspicious." She looked through the evidence with the same horrified fascination I'd experienced when Ben first showed me the truth. I watched her face change as she processed what she was seeing, the timeline, the hotels, the intimate photos of her husband with another woman. "Almost a year," she whispered, looking at timestamps from the previous fall. "He's been doing this for almost a year." She looked up at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "How did you find out?" I told her about the cafe, about Sandra's lies and eventual confession, about Ben's surveillance and the evidence he'd gathered. Jennifer listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding like pieces of a puzzle were falling into place in her mind. "There was a company Christmas party in December," she said finally. "Kevin came home late, said he'd been networking. But he was different afterward. Distracted, secretive. He started guarding his phone, taking calls in other rooms. I asked him about it, and he said I was being paranoid. The cruelty of it struck me again. Not just the affairs themselves, but the gaslighting, the way both Kevin and Sandra had made us question our own perceptions and instincts." "What are you going to do?" I asked. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the photos of her husband kissing my wife. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Part of me wants to confront him immediately. Part of me wants to get a lawyer first. What about you?" "I'm still figuring that out too, but I know I'm not going to let them just walk away from this like nothing happened." We talked for nearly 2 hours, sharing details and filling in gaps in each other's knowledge. By the time we parted ways, I felt like I'd gained an ally in what had previously felt like a very lonely battle. "They've underestimated us, James," Jennifer said as we stood to leave. "Both of them. They think we're too nice, too trusting to fight back. Let's show them how wrong they are." Her words stayed with me as I drove home. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel like I was facing this alone. Jennifer was smart, determined, and just as motivated as I was to make sure Kevin and Sandra faced consequences for their actions. But the real confrontation was still ahead of us. The day Jennifer confronted Kevin was one I'll never forget. She had texted me that morning with a simple message. "I'm doing it today. Be ready for whatever comes next." I wasn't sure what that meant, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. By noon, my phone started buzzing with messages. First from Sandra, then from an unknown number that I quickly realized was Kevin. Sandra's message was short and furious. "What the hell did you do, James? How could you involve Jennifer?" Kevin's messages were longer and increasingly desperate. "You don't know what you've done. You're destroying a family. Jennifer doesn't deserve this. Why couldn't you just handle this between adults?" The irony of Kevin lecturing me about destroying families and handling things between adults was almost laughable. This was the man who'd been having an affair with my wife for nearly a year, who'd been planning to abandon his own family to start a new life with Sandra, who'd been documented making jokes about both our spouses behind our backs. But the messages kept coming. Kevin seemed to be spiraling, sending increasingly frantic texts about how I'd crossed a line and destroyed innocent lives. He was clearly not handling Jennifer's confrontation well. Later that evening, Jennifer called me and recounted everything. She'd presented Kevin with the evidence when he came home from work, spreading it out on their kitchen table, much like I'd done with Sandra. He tried to deny it at first, Jennifer told me, her voice steady but tired. Even with the photos right in front of him, he claimed they were fabricated somehow. But when I showed him the text messages, especially the ones where he and Sandra discussed what they'd do with the money after our divorces, he finally broke down. What did he say? He tried to blame everyone else. First, it was Sandra's fault for seducing him. Then it was my fault for not being emotionally available enough. Finally, he tried to blame you for exposing everything instead of just quietly accepting it. I shook my head, even though Jennifer couldn't see me. The same excuse Sandra used. Apparently, we're responsible for their decisions to cheat. Exactly. But here's the thing, James. I don't think Kevin realized how much I knew about our finances, about his work, about everything. He thought he could manipulate me the way he's been manipulating you and Sandra. He was wrong. What do you mean? Jennifer's voice took on a harder edge. I mean, I've been doing some investigating of my own since you first contacted me. Kevin's been siphoning money from our joint accounts for months, probably to pay for hotel rooms and gifts for Sandra. He's also been lying to his employer about his whereabouts during those afternoon meetings. And I found out Sandra isn't the first affair, just the most serious one. This was news to me. There were others. At least 2 that I can document. Kevin has a pattern, James. He finds women who are vulnerable or unhappy in their marriages, and he positions himself as their savior. The emotional support they're not getting at home. But he's never left me before because it's always been easier to have both, the stable home life and the exciting affair. The picture Jennifer was painting was even worse than I'd imagined. Kevin wasn't just an unfaithful husband, he was a serial manipulator who'd made a hobby of destroying other people's marriages while protecting his own comfortable life. What are you going to do? I asked. I'm done enabling him, Jennifer said with a firmness that impressed me. I've already spoken to a lawyer and I'm filing for divorce. But more than that, I think we need to make sure other people know what kind of man he really is. That conversation planted the seed of an idea that would grow into something much bigger than either Jennifer or I initially imagined. Over the next few days, the harassment from Kevin escalated. He started calling me at work, sending long emails explaining why I was destroying innocent lives, even showing up at my house one evening to demand I fix the situation with Jennifer. I didn't answer the door, but I watched him through the window as he paced on my front porch, clearly agitated. He looked nothing like the confident, polished man I'd seen in the cafe with Sandra. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and he had the wild-eyed look of someone whose carefully constructed world was falling apart. The next morning, Sandra showed up unannounced. She looked terrible, not just tired, but genuinely desperate. Her usual perfect appearance was gone, replaced by the look of someone who hadn't been sleeping. "You've ruined everything," she said the moment I opened the door. "Kevin's wife is divorcing him, his kids won't speak to him, you've destroyed a family." I stared at her, amazed by her audacity. I destroyed a family? Sandra, you were having an affair with a married man for almost a year. You were planning to take everything I had so you could start a new life with someone else's husband. Don't stand there and blame me for the consequences of your own choices. You didn't have to involve Jennifer, she snapped, pushing past me into the house like she still lived there. This was between us. You could have handled it quietly. Quietly? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like the way you handled our marriage. Sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, planning to destroy me financially while pretending to love me. She had the grace to look ashamed for about half a second before shifting back into defensive mode. I never meant for it to go this far. I was confused, unhappy. I made mistakes. You made choices, Sandra. Deliberate, calculated choices, and now you get to live with the consequences. What she said next surprised me. Kevin's talking about reconciling with Jennifer. He says the affair with me was a mistake, that he wants to save his marriage. I felt a moment of sympathy for Sandra, seeing how Kevin was abandoning her now that the situation had become complicated. But then I remembered her voice in that video, laughing about how trusting I was, and the sympathy disappeared. "And what about you?" I asked. "What's your plan now?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted, and for the first time in our entire marriage, Sandra looked truly lost. "I thought Kevin and I had something real. But now that everything's falling apart, he's pulling away. Maybe he never intended to leave Jennifer at all. Despite everything she'd done to me, I felt a flicker of the old protectiveness I'd once felt for her, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the reality of what she'd put me through. "I'm sorry your affair isn't working out the way you planned," I said, and I meant it. "But that's not my problem anymore. You made your choice when you decided our marriage wasn't worth fighting for." She nodded slowly, tears starting to form in her eyes. I know I messed up everything. I thought you'd forgive me eventually. I thought we could work it out. Even after planning to take everything I had in a divorce, even after mocking me behind my back for months." She didn't have an answer for that, and we both knew it. Sandra left that day looking smaller somehow, diminished by the reality that her actions had consequences she hadn't anticipated. But I wasn't done yet. Jennifer and I had been discussing a more public approach to accountability, and Kevin's harassment had only strengthened my resolve. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told Jennifer over coffee a few days later, "about making sure other people know what kind of man Kevin really is." Jennifer looked up from her cup, interested. "What do you have in mind?" "Well, Kevin works for Morrison Associates, right? That big architectural firm downtown." "Yes, he's actually a partner, which is why he felt so secure in his behavior. He thought his position protected him." "What if it didn't?" I asked. "What if his colleagues and clients knew what he'd been doing with his afternoons? What if they knew he'd been lying about his whereabouts, using company resources to facilitate personal affairs?" Jennifer's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to file a formal complaint?" "I want to file several formal complaints. His company has a code of conduct, right? Policies about honesty and integrity." "They do," Jennifer confirmed. "Kevin used to complain about having to sit through ethics seminars every year. He said they were a waste of time because everyone knows how to behave professionally." The irony was perfect. We spent the next hour planning our approach. Jennifer had access to Kevin's work calendar and could document the times he'd been allegedly in client meetings when he was actually with Sandra. I had Ben's photos showing Kevin entering hotels during business hours while supposedly working on projects. But we decided to go even further. Sandra's interior design firm often collaborated with architectural companies on large projects. If she'd been using work time and resources to facilitate her affair, her employer deserved to know about that too. "We're not being vindictive," Jennifer said as we finalized our plans. "We're being responsible. Kevin and Sandra used their professional lives to cover for their personal betrayals. Their employers have a right to know that." I agreed completely. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about accountability. Kevin and Sandra had assumed their actions would only affect their personal relationships, that they could compartmentalize their deception and protect their professional reputations. They were about to learn otherwise. The formal complaints we filed were thorough and well documented. We included timelines, photographs, copies of text messages that referenced using work time for personal meetings, and evidence of Kevin's pattern of dishonesty with his colleagues about his whereabouts. The response was swift and devastating. Kevin's firm launched an immediate internal investigation. Sandra's company, faced with evidence that she'd been conducting a personal affair during business hours and using company resources to facilitate meetings, suspended her pending their own review. Within 2 weeks, both of their professional lives were in ruins. Kevin was forced to resign his partnership and was facing potential legal action for misuse of company resources. Sandra's contract wasn't renewed, and word spread quickly through the interior design community about the circumstances surrounding her departure. The professional consequences were actually more severe than either Jennifer or I had anticipated, but we felt no guilt about it. Kevin and Sandra had made their choices, and those choices had ripple effects they apparently hadn't considered. As the dust began to settle from the professional fallout, I found myself dealing with an unexpected challenge. The reactions of friends and family who learned what had happened. The responses were more complicated than I'd expected. Some people were completely supportive, expressing outrage at Sandra's betrayal and admiration for how I'd handled the situation, but others seemed uncomfortable with the extent to which I'd fought back. My brother called me one evening, his voice concerned. "James, I heard about what happened with Sandra. I'm sorry, man, that's terrible. But are you sure you handled it the right way? Some people are saying you went too far with the professional stuff." "What exactly did I go too far with, David?" I asked, feeling my temper rise. "Telling the truth? Providing evidence of what actually happened?" I mean destroying their careers. That seems pretty extreme. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I didn't destroy their careers. They destroyed their own careers by lying to their employers and using company resources to facilitate an affair. I just made sure the right people knew about it. But now Sandra's basically unemployable in the city. And Kevin's lost his partnership. Don't you think that's enough? The question frustrated me because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had happened. David, Sandra, and Kevin weren't planning to quietly end their marriages and start fresh. They were planning to destroy Jennifer and me financially, to take everything we'd worked for and use it to build their new life together. They spent months mocking us, calling us stupid and trusting while they planned our destruction. The professional consequences are nothing compared to what they were planning to do to us. My brother was quiet for a moment. I guess I thought you'd be more focused on moving on than on getting revenge. This isn't revenge, I said firmly. This is accountability. There's a difference. But the conversation stayed with me because it wasn't unique. Several mutual friends had expressed similar concerns, suggesting that I should have handled Sandra's betrayal more privately or maturely. The implication seemed to be that being betrayed meant I should absorb the damage quietly and move on without making waves. Jennifer was dealing with similar reactions. When we met for coffee a few days later, she looked frustrated. Kevin's sister called me yesterday, she told me. She wanted me to know that Kevin is devastated by the professional consequences and that the whole family thinks I'm being vindictive. Apparently, I should have handled this privately for the sake of the children. I shook my head. For the sake of the children. Kevin should have thought about his children before he started having affairs. Exactly what I told her. But it's interesting how quickly the focus shifted from Kevin's behavior to my response to his behavior. Like the real problem isn't what he did, but how I reacted to what he did. This seemed to be a pattern. The people who'd been betrayed were somehow expected to absorb the damage quietly and take the high road, while the people who'd done the betraying were treated as victims when they faced consequences for their actions. Are you having second thoughts? I asked Jennifer. She considered the question seriously before answering. Sometimes I wonder if we went too far. But then I remember those text messages where Kevin and Sandra joked about how stupid and trusting we were. I remember all the nights Kevin came home late, kissing me hello while he was carrying the scent of another woman's perfume. I remember how he looked me in the eye and lied for months while planning to destroy our marriage. She paused, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. No, I'm not having second thoughts. Kevin made his choices. The consequences are his to live with. I felt the same way. The people criticizing our response seemed to think that being betrayed should make us more understanding, more willing to absorb damage quietly. But betrayal had actually taught me the opposite lesson, that protecting yourself sometimes requires being willing to make waves, to insist on accountability even when it makes other people uncomfortable. Sandra and Kevin had counted on our decency, our reluctance to cause scenes or create complications. They'd assumed we'd handle their betrayals quietly, like good little victims. They'd been wrong about that, and the consequences were theirs to manage. 3 months after that afternoon in the cafe, I was finally starting to feel like myself again. The house that had felt so empty and strange without Sandra began to feel like home, my home, not the shared space of a marriage built on lies. I'd started redecorating, removing traces of Sandra's influence and replacing them with things that actually reflected my own tastes. It was surprising to realize how many of our shared preferences had actually been her preferences that I'd simply accepted. The elaborate window treatments she'd insisted on, the modernist art that I'd never really liked, the color schemes that had always felt a little cold to me. Removing these things wasn't vindictive, it was liberating. Jennifer and I had become genuine friends through the experience. We met regularly for coffee, sometimes to discuss the ongoing legal proceedings from our respective divorces, but increasingly just to talk about life, books, current events. She was intelligent and thoughtful in ways that reminded me what real companionship felt like. "How are you doing with all the professional fallout?" she asked during one of our meetings. I'd been wondering about this myself. Kevin's career was essentially over in our city. Word had spread through the architectural community about the circumstances of his departure from Morrison Associates. He'd apparently been trying to find work in other cities, but the professional world was smaller than he'd realized. Sandra was in an even worse position. Interior design was a relationship-based business, and her reputation for dishonesty had made her effectively unemployable locally. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she was considering leaving the city entirely. I feel satisfied, I said honestly. Not happy that they're struggling, exactly, but satisfied that their actions had consequences. For so long, it felt like they were getting away with everything, while Jennifer and I absorbed all the damage. I know exactly what you mean, Jennifer replied. Kevin tried to call me last week. He wanted to know if there was anything I could do to repair his reputation professionally. The audacity was incredible. What did you tell him? I told him that his reputation was his responsibility to manage, not mine. That maybe he should have considered the professional implications before he decided to use company time and resources to facilitate an affair. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people walk by on the sidewalk outside the cafe. Normal people going about their normal lives, probably dealing with the usual complications of work and relationships, but not, presumably, with spouses who'd been conducting year-long affairs while planning their financial destruction. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Ben hadn't been watching them? Jennifer asked. If you'd never found out the full extent of what they were planning? I'd thought about this often. I think eventually Sandra would have moved forward with the divorce, probably painted me as the boring husband who didn't understand her, and taken everything she could get. I would have spent years wondering what I'd done wrong, why our marriage had failed, how I could have been a better husband. And I would have spent years thinking I was paranoid and suspicious for questioning Kevin's increasingly obvious lies, Jennifer added. The gaslighting was almost worse than the affair itself, I reflected. Being made to question your own perceptions, to doubt your own instincts. They were both so good at making us feel like we were the problem. Jennifer nodded emphatically. Kevin was a master at that. Whenever I questioned his absences or his secretiveness, he'd turn it around on me. I was being controlling, paranoid, insecure. I started to believe him. Sandra did the same thing. When I noticed how distant she'd become, she'd tell me I was being needy or clingy. When I suggested we plan more time together, she'd say I was pressuring her. I spent months thinking I was the reason our marriage was struggling. The manipulation had been subtle but constant, designed to make us doubt our own judgment, while Sandra and Kevin pursued their affair with increasing boldness. They'd been training us to accept their deception, to question our own perceptions rather than their behavior. I'm glad we fought back, Jennifer said finally. I'm glad we didn't just absorb the damage quietly and move on like good little victims. So am I agreed, even if some people think we went too far. Let them think that, Jennifer replied with a slight smile. They weren't the ones being betrayed and manipulated for months. They don't get to decide how we should respond to that. 6 months after Sandra left, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from Claire, one of Sandra's closest friends, someone I'd known for years but hadn't spoken to since the separation. James, she said, her voice careful and slightly nervous. I hope you don't mind me calling. I've been wanting to talk to you about everything that happened. I was immediately suspicious. Claire and Sandra had been friends since college, and I assumed this was some kind of intervention on Sandra's behalf. What about Claire? I wanted to apologize, she said, surprising me, and to tell you that I think Sandra owed you a much better explanation than she gave you. This was not what I'd expected. What do you mean? Claire sighed heavily. Sandra's been staying with me for the past few weeks. Her lease ran out, and she's having trouble finding work, so I offered her my guest room temporarily. But living with her has been eye-opening. How so? She talks about you constantly, but not in the way you might expect. She's angry, James, really angry. Not guilty or remorseful, just angry that her affair got exposed and that there were consequences for it. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Even after everything, hearing about Sandra's continued lack of remorse was painful. She keeps saying that you overreacted, that you should have handled it privately between the two of you. She can't understand why you involved Jennifer or why you reported Kevin to his employer. She genuinely seems to think that discovering her affair should have made you more understanding, not less. What about Kevin? I asked. That's the worst part, Claire said, her voice taking on a disgusted tone. She's furious with him for trying to reconcile with Jennifer. She really believed he was going to leave his wife for her, and now she feels like he used her. But instead of recognizing that she was complicit in using him to cheat on you, she's just angry that the affair didn't work out the way she wanted. The picture Claire was painting was of someone completely divorced from reality. Someone who couldn't accept responsibility for her choices, even when faced with their obvious consequences. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I've been Sandra's friend for 15 years, and I've watched her do this before. Not to this extent, but this pattern of blaming everyone else when her choices don't work out the way she wants. I've enabled it by staying quiet, by being the supportive friend who doesn't ask hard questions." Claire paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath. "But listening to her talk about you these past few weeks, hearing her describe your marriage like you were some kind of burden she had to endure while pursuing her real life with Kevin, it's made me realize that the person I thought I knew doesn't actually exist." "What do you mean?" "I mean Sandra's been rewriting history. According to her, you were controlling and emotionally unavailable. Your marriage was loveless and stifling. She was basically forced to look elsewhere for understanding and companionship. But James, I was there. I saw you two together for years. I saw how patient and supportive you were, how hard you tried to make her happy even when she was becoming increasingly difficult to please. The validation was unexpected and deeply meaningful. For months, I'd wondered if maybe I really had been a bad husband, if Sandra's unhappiness was somehow my fault." "She's also been telling people that you destroyed Kevin's marriage out of spite," Claire continued, "that Jennifer would never have found out about the affair if you hadn't interfered. Like Kevin's choices had nothing to do with the consequences he's facing." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think Kevin and Sandra are both adults who made deliberate choices for nearly a year. I think they planned to destroy your marriage and Jennifer's marriage so they could be together. I think when that plan fell apart, they both started looking for someone else to blame rather than accepting responsibility for what they'd done." Claire's call was a gift I hadn't known I needed. Hearing from someone who'd known us both for years, someone who'd witnessed our marriage from the outside, that Sandra's version of events was revisionist fiction, helped me finally let go of the last lingering guilt I'd been carrying. "Thank you for calling," I told her. "I needed to hear that." "I'm sorry it took me so long to reach out," Claire replied. "And James, I think you're going to be much happier without her. I think you already are." She was right. I was happier, even though I hadn't fully recognized it until she said it. The constant low-level anxiety of living with someone who was perpetually dissatisfied, who always seemed to be looking for something else, somewhere else to be happy, that was gone. In its place was a peace I hadn't felt in years. A year after Sandra left, I was living a completely different life. Not dramatically different on the surface, I still had the same job, the same house, many of the same routines. But everything felt lighter, more authentic, more genuinely mine. Jennifer and I had grown closer, though we'd both agreed to take things slowly. We'd been through too much upheaval to rush into anything new, but there was a natural compatibility between us that felt promising. She was kind without being naive, strong without being bitter, intelligent without being complicated for the sake of being complicated. "I think Kevin's moving to Phoenix," she told me over dinner one evening. "His sister lives there, and apparently he thinks he can start fresh somewhere new." "What about his kids?" "That's the saddest part. Emma and Michael are old enough to understand what happened, and they're angry with him. Not because of the divorce necessarily, but because of how he handled it. The lying, the attempts to blame everyone else, the way he tried to manipulate them into taking sides." I felt a pang of sympathy for Kevin's children, who'd done nothing wrong but were dealing with the fallout from their father's choices. "Sandra's been asking mutual friends about you," Jennifer mentioned casually. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you're dating anyone, how you're handling the divorce financially, whether you seem happy." Jennifer paused, studying my face. "I think she's realizing what she gave up." The idea that Sandra might be having regrets should have felt satisfying, but mostly it just felt sad. Too little, too late, and for all the wrong reasons. "I don't think she's capable of genuinely regretting hurting me," I said. "I think she might regret that her plan didn't work out, that Kevin didn't leave Jennifer for her, that there were professional consequences she didn't anticipate. But I don't think she's capable of regretting the betrayal itself." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "Kevin's the same way. He called me a few months ago, supposedly to apologize, but the whole conversation was really about how unfair it was that he'd lost his career over a personal matter. Like his year-long affair was equivalent to a parking ticket. We finished dinner and walked through the park where I'd first met Ben, where this whole nightmare had begun to make sense. It was a warm evening in late spring, and families were out with their children, couples were walking hand in hand, teenagers were playing frisbee. Normal life continuing around us. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Sandra had just told you she was unhappy and wanted to work on the marriage instead of starting an affair? Jennifer asked. I'd thought about this countless times. Honestly, I think I would have done anything to save it. Gone to counseling, changed jobs, moved to a different city, whatever she needed. Which is probably exactly why she didn't tell me, because she didn't want to save the marriage. She wanted out, but she wanted to be the victim instead of the villain. The affair gave her a narrative where she was the misunderstood wife who'd found true love with someone who appreciated her, Jennifer observed. If she'd just asked for a divorce, she would have been the person who gave up on a 10-year marriage. And she wouldn't have had Kevin as a safety net. She could pursue him while still having me as backup in case it didn't work out. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts. The past year had been difficult in ways I'd never anticipated, but it had also been revelatory. I'd learned things about myself, about relationships, about the difference between love and attachment that I couldn't have learned any other way. I'm glad it happened, I said suddenly, surprising myself with the statement. Jennifer looked at me with raised eyebrows. Really? I mean, I wish it hadn't been so painful and humiliating. I wish Sandra had been honest with me from the beginning. But I'm glad I found out who she really was, instead of spending the rest of my life married to someone who was fundamentally dishonest. I feel the same way, Jennifer admitted. Kevin showed me who he really was, and as painful as that was, it was also liberating. I'm not wasting any more of my life with someone who sees me as convenient rather than precious. That phrase stuck with me. Convenient rather than precious. It perfectly captured the difference between Sandra's attitude toward our marriage and what I'd thought we had together. As we walked back toward my car, Jennifer slipped her hand into mine. It felt natural, comfortable, like something that had been waiting to happen when we were both ready for it. You know what the strangest part is? I said as we reached the car. What? I'm actually grateful to Ben. If he hadn't been documenting their affair, if he hadn't reached out to me, I might have spent years trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I might have blamed myself for Sandra's unhappiness, tried to win her back, never understood that the problem wasn't me, it was her inability to be honest about what she wanted. Jennifer squeezed my hand. Ben probably saved both of us from years of self-doubt and manipulation. Have you ever thought about trying to contact him? To thank him? I thought about it, but I think Ben needs to move on from Sandra too. He's been carrying this anger and obsession for years. Helping us was probably his way of finally getting closure. She was probably right. Ben's surveillance of Sandra and Kevin had been unhealthy, but it had also been necessary. Without his documentation, Sandra and Kevin might have succeeded in gaslighting both Jennifer and me into accepting their version of events. As I drove home that night, I realized that for the first time in over a year, I was excited about the future instead of just trying to recover from the past. Sandra's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. I was free to build a life based on honesty instead of convenient fictions. With someone who saw me clearly, instead of someone who saw me as an obstacle to her real desires. The worst chapter of my life was finally closed, and I was ready to start writing a new one.